In this video, we're going to talk about 7 things that Brits may regret when they make the big move to Canada. So grab a Tim's or any tea, coffee or water for that matter and join me on this journey. So the first thing I'm going to talk about that Brits may regret, or at least something that I really missed when I moved to Canada, is actually being so far away from home. And I get that may seem pretty obvious when you move, but you don't truly realize that until you're there. And one thing you may start to notice is you start to miss things like birthdays or big events that happen, and you're just so far away from home. So in my case, one of my best friends has recently had a baby, and one of the most challenging things is not being able to be there or being there for friends and family's birthdays, weddings, any exciting things that you just feel like you're missing because you are so far away from home. This also makes me feel like when I do go back to England, I sometimes have that feeling which I don't want to go back to Canada. And it's not because I don't want to go back, but it's because you're doing so many things or you're catching up with so many friends that it really does hit home that you have moved thousands of miles away. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't regret moving to Canada at all, but it's just something that you need to consider before you make that big move. So the second thing I want to talk about is that Canada is a lot more expensive than what I initially thought it would be. Now, I feel like living in England, we kind of have the assumption that Canada and as well as the US are much cheaper compared to the UK, and there was definitely a time when that was the case. So for example, when I came to Canada as a kid, I remember that £1 would be around $2, which just felt awesome. I remember feeling like I had so much money coming here, but that was then and this is now. And now that is not the case at all. And things do seem to be a lot more expensive, whether that is grocery stores, cell phone bills, or even buying a house. Now, I'm very lucky living in the province of Saskatchewan, which is much cheaper than other places. But again, it's going to be more expensive depending on the province that you choose to live, which is why before you move anywhere, you want to do your research as to see which province that you want to move to, but also the general cost of living in that province. And again, it's going to vary between city to city or town or village, depending on where you want to live. One thing I will say is the bigger city you're going to be, the more expensive it is going to be. So for example, as I said, I live about an hour outside Saskatoon. But if I was to live in a bigger city like Vancouver or Toronto or Montreal, for example, that's going to be so much more expensive than what it is living in Saskatoon. So again, something just to think about before you make that big move. And I will say places like Vancouver and Toronto are very comparable to cities like London, both in terms of things to do, but also in terms of the cost that comes with that. So moving to a big city like that is certainly not going to be any different than what it is living in London. So the next thing I want to talk about is your life almost feels like you're on pause when you first move anyway. And for me, when I first moved, I moved to a new city, a new place, and I was lucky because I was with my partner who's actually Canadian, and we went back to her hometown. But I remember these first few months when I was here, I almost went through a bit of an identity crisis that I didn't really know what I was going to do in the long term. And I was lucky I moved with a full-time job that I actually really enjoyed and I loved. But I was always thinking, what's next? What am I going to be doing in a year's time? And these are questions that, of course, I didn't need to know that at the time. But your life almost feels like it's on pause, and it can be almost like, it almost feels like you're in the unknown. So for example, we didn't know at that point that we were going to buy a house, or we didn't know at that point where we was actually going to live. And these things can be quite scary. And I don't regret this at all. In fact, I loved the way I did move to Canada, but it's something just to be mindful of. So when I actually moved to Canada, I ended up in a different city to what I was expecting to live in. And I actually live in a way smaller city than what I thought I would live in. And again, now I love it, but that definitely took a bit of time to adjust to. And the reason why was actually in the bigger cities, getting jobs, especially as a new immigrant to Canada, was much more difficult because I didn't have that Canadian experience. Kind of made me question, will I ever be in a position where I will be able to move to a place, to a bigger city? And things didn't work out like that. I actually stayed in the same city where I originally moved to. But your mind definitely wanders when you move to any new country, and you always think that what if, what will happen? But then you also think what's happening at home as well, and then you always think what would have happened if I would have stayed at home. And the reality is I am glad I made the move, but that doesn't stop those thoughts going through my head at least. So number 4, it's really hard to travel outside North America. And hear me out on this one. This obviously depends on where you live and the city that you live in. So for example, if you're in somewhere like Vancouver or Toronto or somewhere with at least a bigger international airport, then traveling is going to be much easier. Where I am in Saskatchewan, that can be a little bit more tricky, at least because things are so far apart. So for example, I went to Vancouver for a weekend a few months ago, and that actually set me back around $1,500 just for a 2-day weekend, which is crazy. But again, we had to fly there. Sometimes it feels like the cost of flying within Canada is so expensive that I may as well go back home to England or somewhere like that, which makes it a little bit hard to travel. Now, the nearest major city to where I live will be Edmonton, and that's a 4-hour drive away. So let's say I want to go there for the weekend, which I do at least every few months, but then that's 4 hours there, 4 hours back, which means that we would spend 8 hours of our weekend driving, which is a crazy amount. But I will say, when you get here, at least for me, that kind of just became the norm, which is something that I wouldn't have expected. Canada is just such a big country that traveling within it can be much more difficult unless you have a lot of time on your hands. And if you work remotely, for example, this may be a little bit easier, but for me, that is not the case. I feel like I don't have as much time to travel as I wish, apart from the summers. I guess this is a bit of an unfair comparison because when I lived back in England, I was living in London, and I lived in Ealing, which is in West London, which is only 15 minutes on the Elizabeth line to Heathrow Airport. So the comparison actually is really unfair. But then on the flip side, I will say there is so much nature to explore within Canada. And honestly, Canada is such a beautiful country that I don't really have a desire to leave the same way I did when I lived in England. So number 5, you may have to drive in winter, and depending on where you are, it is not fun. And what I will say is, if you hate driving in England or in the UK, you are likely gonna hate driving in Canada too. And I love driving in summer. I think driving in summer is a lot of fun. You can have some really cool road trips, but in winter, it is a completely different story. And at least where I am in Saskatchewan, the weather and the temperature can be so cold, or the road conditions can be really tough too. So I've had a few times where I've unintentionally drove in a snowstorm where I didn't have the ability to necessarily pull over and stop. And let me tell you, this is some of the most scariest experiences of my life because I'm not a confident driver, and this is something where this is not going to be the case for everybody. If you feel comfortable driving in some of those more extreme conditions, then you might be okay. But for me, even now, I still get anxious driving in winter. And I've been here now for 3 years, and I thought this is something that I would overcome, but I haven't. And even now, I often still rely on my Canadian partner to drive in those more extreme conditions. And I feel bad about that. But I've had times when I've almost felt like I'm having a panic attack in the car, which is something I never experienced in the UK whatsoever. And I will say the first time I actually drove by myself, I got stuck in a ditch. And to be honest, that probably contributes as to why that happened. But the downside is, at least where I live, you don't have that same access to public transportation that you would have done or that I would have done when I was living in London. And this is obviously going to be different if you're living in a big city. So I know Vancouver, Toronto, Edmonton, Calgary, they all have pretty decent public transit systems. But where I live, that just isn't the case. And we do have a bus to Saskatoon and Edmonton, but I'm pretty sure it only runs a few times a week. And it is obviously not good enough to rely on, which then makes you have to drive if you want to go somewhere. And if you do like to walk, again, depending on where you are, I will say that walking in Canada isn't always as fun, especially if you're outside those bigger cities. And a lot of the cities aren't made for walking, so it just makes it that little bit more tough, with of course the exception of places like Vancouver and Toronto. And even if I can, I will still walk to places, but it's just not as nice of an experience, I guess, as what it would have been living in the UK. The next thing that Brits may find really hard when you move is that it can be really hard to make friends. And this is something that I feel like I've been really fortunate in that I've made some really good friends since I have moved to Canada. And that's just because I've worked with such amazing colleagues who have become really good friends, and I've been really fortunate about that. But I know that's something that can be really tough, and I know many people who do struggle to make friends when they move here. Again, I was lucky because my partner had lived in this city for most of her life, so that when she moved back, I was able to become friends with her friends and kind of be involved within her social circle to an extent, as well as my work friends, which made a huge difference. But this can be quite tough, especially when you move to a new country. And something I find, especially in bigger cities, is there's a lot of people who move around too. In fact, even where I live too. So you might become friends with somebody, but then they move on to somewhere else. Or us being in a slightly smaller city, people often move to a bigger city, which then means that you have these friends, but then often they are living in other places. One example, one of my closest friends in Canada is actually somebody who I knew back at home, and they live in the city of Regina, which is about 4 hours drive from me, which is still so far away. But then at the same time, I will still happily make that journey to see them, because again, friendships and keeping those friendships are really, really important when you move away. And that leads me on to the last one, which is number 7, which is that there isn't a pub culture like there is in the UK. And this obviously depends on you and what you like to do in terms of socializing with other people. But for me, this is something I really miss. And a lot of Canadians socialize in their houses, which again is pretty nice, and often it's cheaper. But as a Brit, I really just miss that going to the pub, seeing friends, and even just catching up with people. For us, we would always walk there, we would chat for hours, and then walk home a few hours later. And I think because it's so much within our culture, it's something that I never would have thought I would have missed until I didn't have that. And in some of those bigger cities, you do have British pubs, for example. So I know in Edmonton there's some, in Calgary there's some, and I'm sure there are in other cities. But it obviously isn't the same as what it would be at home. And again, this shouldn't be a deal breaker for you. In fact, none of these things should be a deal breaker for you. But it's just something that I didn't realize I would miss until I didn't have the same access to that as what I did at home. So there we have it. There are 7 things that Brits may regret when they make the move to Canada. One thing I will say is just take this with a pinch of salt. If you're a Brit who's moved to Canada and there's different things that you may have experienced or regret or miss from the UK, then I want to know in the comments down below. If you're new to the channel, my name is Jack and I moved to Canada in January of 2022 from London and Milton Keynes, and I'm now living in Saskatchewan in Canada. And if you want to see more stuff like this, feel free to hit that subscribe button. I haven't been making as many videos as what I would like to, but that is something I would like to do more and more as the new year hits. So thank you so much for watching, take care, and I will talk to you all soon. Bye for now.